A few weeks ago, I was sitting in a cafe with a friend I hadn't seen in months. And on the surface, she looked great, sharp, engaged, laughing at the right moments.
The way we expect people to look when they've moved on.
Exactly. Most people would say she had moved on from the collapse of her long-term relationship. But then a specific song started playing over the speakers. She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she just looked down at her hands with this kind of detached, eerie curiosity, as if they belonged to someone else.
Wow.
And she told me something that it stayed with me. She said, "I'm not sad about him anymore. I'm just grieving the woman I was when I was with him. And I have no idea who is sitting in this chair right now."
That's such a precise and devastating way to put it.
It really is. We tend to think of grief as something with a clear protocol, a casket, a cemetery, a few weeks of black clothing, and then the slow return to normal. But there are losses that make no noise.
The silent losses.
Yeah. There are no flowers for the version of yourself that disappeared after a burnout, or for the future you imagine that will never happen. There are no rituals for the parent who is still alive but has become a stranger.
And we're told that time heals, as if the calendar is a doctor.
Right. We treat grief as this temporary malfunction that needs to be managed so we can get back to being productive. But what if that's just a fundamental misunderstanding?
What if it's not a malfunction at all?
What if grief isn't an illness you recover from, but a biological and psychological restructuring? It doesn't console you, it forces you to change shape. Most of us are terrified of it because it strips away the illusion of control.
We all want to get back to our old selves.
But the living world doesn't work in reverse. If you've ever felt a lingering sense of unreality or a physical exhaustion that sleep can't touch, you might be in the middle of a transition you haven't even named yet. Because the hardest part of mourning isn't learning how to live without someone else, it's learning how to live as the stranger you've become.
That framing of grief as a restructuring process is the exact direction that modern research is pushing us. It's a complete pivot.
A pivot from what, exactly?
From viewing this intense mental pain as a sign of disorder toward viewing it through the lens of function contessory, of understanding what it is biologically for.
Okay, let's unpack this tremendous idea. Our mission today is to take this concept that grief is a fundamental transformation, not just something you get over, and ground it firmly in science. We are doing a deep dive into the evolutionary and neurological mechanics of loss to understand the tremendous, energetically costly work your brain has to perform just to survive in absence.
And the sources we're looking at today really challenge that simplistic idea of grief as a temporary bug in the system.
Instead, they position it as an adaptive mechanism, a massive neurological recalibration, and maybe most importantly for us today, a victim of modern cultural mismatch.
Yeah, we're moving past the familiar, the often misused psychological stages and getting down to the core science. We want to understand why the pain is so overwhelming and what that pain is actually forcing the brain to do at a foundational cognitive level.
I think the most compelling place to start is with the fundamental evolutionary paradox.
It's a great place to start.
If the entire machinery of natural selection is engineered to favor traits that maximize survival and fitness, why on earth does grief, a phenomenon characterized by these intensely stressful symptoms like deep sadness, consuming rumination, cognitive disruption, physical exhaustion, why does it persist across all human cultures and all of history?
Right. I mean, these symptoms are debilitating. They seem to actively disrupt an individual's ability to hunt, gather, defend themselves, or care for their kids.
You'd think it would have been selected out of the gene pool.
It truly is the ultimate puzzle for evolutionary science. You would expect selection pressures to minimize any response that carries such high somatic costs and disrupts core functions. Yet, here we are, universally wired for this painful experience.
So how do the sources explain this?
Well, they address this tension by presenting two primary and kind of competing theories about grief's origin and purpose.
Let's start with the theory that says grief, at least when it's caused by death, is essentially a biological mistake, a misfiring of a useful system.
That's the byproduct account, which is often called the reunion account.
The reunion account.
Exactly. The reunion account doesn't deny the pain, but it argues that grief, when it's triggered by a permanent death, is a non-adaptive side effect of a much older, highly adaptive system.
And that system is?
The separation response. Think of any social mammal or pair-bonded species. When they're separated from a vital partner, a parent, a mate, a core group member, they exhibit intense distress.
They search, they call out.
They search, they vocalize. This mechanism is profoundly adaptive because its entire purpose is to promote reunification with a living partner, to restore that bond and enhance collective survival.
So if the system works perfectly when separation is temporary, what happens when death makes it permanent?
When death occurs, the cognitive and affective system that governs attachment is correctly triggered. It registers the sudden absence as a separation event. But because reunion is biologically impossible, the resulting searching behavior, the distress, the yearning, it all becomes futile.
And that futility creates the prolonged acute pain we call grief.
Yes. The source material calls this constraints on optimality. It means the attachment system is so powerful and so essential for forming bonds in the first place that it can't be perfectly optimized to just shut down cleanly and instantly when permanent death happens.
So the price we pay for being able to love so deeply is that sometimes the system misfires and hurts us immensely.
It's the necessary, unavoidable cost. The body and brain are wired to cry out and search, even when the rational mind knows that search is useless.
So your biological wiring is screaming, search, find them, even while you're, signing the death certificate.
That captures the deep sense of inner conflict perfectly. It positions the core elements of suffering, the profound sense of loss and the restless searching, as the unavoidable downside of a mechanism that allows us to form the deep bonds necessary for human survival.
But then we have the other side of the coin, the adaptation theories.
Right. These theories don't rely on a misfire.
They argue that some of the symptoms we associate with grief do have direct adaptive benefits, even after a permanent loss has occurred.
That's where the analysis moves from reunification to reassessment and social dynamics. Adaptation theories focus on the next step for the surviving individual and their group.
So why would intense sadness and rumination be useful? To us now, it just looks like depression.
And that intense sadness often leads to withdrawal and reduced activity. In the modern world, yeah, we pathologize that.
Yeah.
But how is it helpful ancestrally?
Okay, how?
It serves two main functions. Internally, the low mood and reduction in activity foster a necessary disengagement from the deceased, and crucially, it prompts the surviving individual to conserve energy.
And that conserved energy is then channeled into
Analytical rumination, a single-minded focus on a highly complex problem.
And the problem in this case isn't why did I fail? It's how do I rebuild my resources, my future, and my identity without this key person?
Precisely. The adaptive function is to force a painful but productive reassessment of your future plans, your priorities, your surviving relationships. It's an internal mechanism that forces the bereaved to stop operating on autopilot and plan for life in a fundamentally altered world.
So that's the internal benefit. What's the external one? You mentioned social signaling.
Yes, this is extremely important in the ancestral context. The intense visible symptoms of grief, weeping, lamentation, visible distress act as a hard-to-fake signal to the social group.
Hard to fake, meaning you can't just pretend to be that devastated.
You really can't. And by displaying that profound loss, the bereaved individual communicates two things. First, that they have the capacity for forming strong, durable, high-cost bonds, which makes them a suitable, trustworthy partner for future collaboration.
And
Second, they signal their immediate change in status and their urgent need for resources and communal support.
that's fascinating. So grief isn't just about my inner pain. It's a way of broadcasting. I am a high-value relationship partner who is currently critically resource depleted. Help me.
It's a biological flare gun sent up to the tribe. It demands that the community rally and redistribute the burdens of loss to compensate for the sudden loss of a fitness-enhancing relationship.
The sources insist that to really grasp this, we have to disaggregate grief. We can't treat it as just a single blob of misery.
That's right. We have to separate the cognitive symptoms from the purely emotional ones and then track their specific time course.
And when we do that, what's the key cognitive mechanism we see?
When we look at the cognitive mechanism that's most directly involved in updating the world map, we find cognitive vigilance. This is the preoccupation with thoughts of the deceased and the heightened attention deployed toward detecting any cues that they might be in the environment.
So it's the internal monitoring system being cranked up to maximum.
To 11, yes. And unlike the overall sadness, which can fluctuate, vigilance tends to follow a very specific trajectory. It typically peaks quite sharply, often around 1 month post-loss, when the initial shock has worn off, but the absence is fully registered.
And then it slowly fades.
It then slowly, painfully lessens over the next 6 to 12 months as the brain incrementally adjusts. The individual is actively scanning the world for a person they consciously know is gone. And that brings us directly into the massive work of neurological recalibration.
Okay, so let's pivot now to the physical mechanism of this pain. If grief is fundamentally a learning process, we need to understand what the brain is learning and why it takes so long.
This is where that analogy of the stolen dining room table is so essential.
Right. To understand the error, we first need to understand the default function.
Our brain is constantly running an internal predictive model, a kind of virtual reality, or as you said, the Google Maps of your brain. This map is built on decades of lived experience and lets us predict the future and navigate seamlessly.
When you walk through your home in the dark, you don't use your eyes. You use that internal map.
Exactly. And if you suddenly find the dining room table has been stolen, your body still instinctively prepares for its presence. Your foot hits empty space, or your hip jerks where the corner should be, even though it isn't.
That collision with reality is the error signal.
Grief, in this context, is that colossal, continuous, and energetically costly error signal generated when the brain's deep, ingrained internal predictive model conflicts profoundly with external, irreversible reality.
The brain expected the loved one to be there. The world says they are not.
And the sheer amount of energy the brain has to expend to resolve that conflict is what produces the profound cognitive fatigue people feel.
So the difficulty of grief, then, isn't just an emotional state. It is the massive mental effort of reconciling two truths simultaneously. This is the core of the gone but also everlasting theory.
This neuroscientific theory posits that the brain is struggling to process two contradictory streams of information. On one side, you have the conscious episodic knowledge.
This is the reflective high-road cognitive system.
Yes, largely rooted in the hippocampus, which registers the physical reality of death. You have the memory of the funeral, the empty chair, the signed documents. That's the gone part.
And what's fighting against that hard reality?
The implicit attachment neurobiology. This is the deep-seated, non-conscious reality encoded during the intense, years-long bonding process. Attachment figures are internalized as permanent, durable resources.
Built on the non-conscious belief, I will always be there for you, and you will always be there for me.
That's the everlasting part. The cognitive mechanisms responsible for quick, automatic, low-road perception still represent the deceased as a living, viable agent.
So the high-road brain is constantly saying, they are dead, while the deep-seated low-road brain keeps screaming, they are still here, I detect their presence, keep searching.
That agonizing conflict is the sustained engine of grief. The grieving process itself becomes the slow, expensive neurological learning required to finally resolve that deep conflict and fully update the predictive map.
And it takes so long because you don't just update the map consciously.
No, you have to update every single behavioral and environmental cue linked to that person. That's why you automatically go to call them or set 2 plates for dinner instead of 1.
We have crucial evidence of this cognitive conflict manifesting in the real world. Researchers call them false recognitions.
False recognitions are those deeply disquieting and almost unsettling moments where the bereaved misperceives external sights or sounds as having been caused by the deceased.
Like hearing their specific footsteps on the stairs.
Or briefly seeing a shadow in the periphery that looks exactly like them. Or catching a specific scent that instantly registers as their presence.
I think most people assume that if you experience something like that, it means you're hallucinating or somehow losing touch with reality.
Right, that it's a sign of pathology. But the sources are clear that this is different.
How so?
They are absolutely different from clinical hallucinations. They are misperceptions, not true hallucinations, because the perceiver quickly identifies them as erroneous.
So the high-road brain corrects the low-road error almost instantly.
Almost, yes. You hear the footsteps, you spin around, and immediately realize, no, that was the radiator or the neighbor or the wind. But for that fraction of a second, the low-road agency detection system fired, creating that uncomfortable feeling of conflict.
And the research shows these experiences are incredibly common.
Very common. Reported by around half of those surveyed who have recently lost a spouse or a very close loved one. It's evidence that the brain is still struggling at the quickest, most automatic level of perception to represent the lost person as permanently unavailable.
And this struggle has a powerful emotional core. The sources point to yearning.
Yearning. When we drill down into the neurobiology of grief, the intensity of yearning is the key affective symptom linked to this cognitive struggle. It's often described as a painful thirst or hunger or an overwhelming desire for reunion.
This is where the research on pair-bonded voles gives us a biological blueprint.
Yes. The Bowl research is a perfect model for attachment science because these rodents form lifelong monogamous bonds. And when they bond, it triggers profound epigenetic changes, changes in how their genes are expressed in a specific deep brain region.
The nucleus accumbens.
The nucleus accumbens, which is generally recognized as the brain's primary reward center. It's heavily involved in pleasure, motivation, and addiction.
And this same region is highly activated in human grief studies.
Exactly. When bereaved individuals are shown pictures of their deceased loved ones while in an fMRI scanner, the nucleus accumbens just lights up.
But the crucial finding isn't just that it's activated.
No. It's that the amount of activation in the nucleus accumbens is strongly correlated with the intensity of the individual's self-reported yearning for the deceased.
So the intensity of the neurological pain isn't dictated by how much time has passed since the loss?
Not directly, no. It's dictated by the persistent, unfulfilled desire for reunion, the lingering yearning, which is tied directly to the brain's reward and motivational circuitry.
The brain is treating the absent loved one like a critical, missing resource it is biologically compelled to find. It is, in a way, addicted to the ghost.
That's a powerful way to put it. The yearning is the motivational drive generated by the attachment system to seek the person whose absence is registered as an acute, life-threatening resource error.
Okay, so if the brain is fundamentally calibrated towards searching and reunion, and if vigilance and false recognitions are the primary cognitive symptoms of this search, we need a theory to explain why the brain sustains this costly search long after the conscious mind knows it's futile.
And that mechanism is provided by error management theory.
Error management theory.
It's a crucial concept in evolutionary psychology. It proposes that natural selection often designs cognitive systems to be biased in one direction when the costs of making two different types of errors are asymmetrical.
The classic example is the smoke detector principle, right?
That's exactly. Explain that.
Well, the cost of a false alarm, the smoke detector goes off because of burnt toast, is minor. It's annoying, you might have to replace the batteries, but the cost of a miss, the detector failing to alert you to a real fire, is catastrophic.
You'll lose your home, your life.
So natural selection favors a system that has a persistently low detection threshold.
It's better to have frequent false alarms than to risk one catastrophic miss. Now, let's apply this asymmetry to the ancestral social environment and the absence of a loved one.
What were the two possible errors there? A miss and a false alarm.
The cost of a miss failing to detect or abandoning the search for a valuable partner who was merely lost, separated, or temporarily incapacitated and could return was enormous.
You lose the opportunity to recover high relationship investment, resources protection, shared knowledge.
And the cost of a false alarm, erroneously believing they were present, wasting a little time and energy looking, was comparatively minor.
That immediately explains the persistence of vigilance and false recognitions. It's biologically safer to sustain the search mechanism, to keep that detection threshold low, than to prematurely accept the permanent absence.
The system is designed to err on the side of caution, which manifests as prolonged suffering. And this vigilance would naturally be amplified based on the value of the relationship. We see increased vigilance and therefore increased pain for individuals with high relationship value, like offspring, or partners who represented a high collective resource investment.
This is where we move from theory to direct evidence, because if the brain is managing signals, the content of the signal's cues of life versus cues of death should have a measurable effect on vigilance.
Exactly. And the sources offer fascinating experimental evidence using pet bereavement studies.
Which are useful because they're intensely personal, but they're less complicated by the massive social and cultural norms surrounding human funerals.
Right. So let's start with the first set of findings. Testing input that suggests the agent is alive. The Cue of Life study.
What did they test?
Researchers surveyed recently bereaved pet owners about their frequency of false recognitions. Hearing the pet bark, seeing them in the corner of their eye, and correlated that with their behavior.
And they found something really counterintuitive.
A striking result. Frequent viewing of realistic photographs of the deceased pet was the strongest independent predictor of increased false recognitions.
That is genuinely shocking, because the common, well-meaning advice we often hear is to keep mementos and photos close to maintain that connection.
And it reveals a profound mismatch between our ancient brains and modern technology. Realistic photographs are an evolutionarily novel stimulus.
Meaning our brains didn't evolve with them.
Not at all. For the brain's ancient mechanisms, a high-fidelity, life-sized image of a valued agent is treated as a reliable cue that the agent remains a viable relationship partner. Even if your conscious mind knows a photo is inanimate, The low-road agency detection system is powerfully activated.
So, by constantly introducing that highly realistic cue of life, we're essentially telling the deep brain, the error signal is wrong. They are still here. And that interferes with the arduous process of redrawing the neural map.
It sustains the low detection threshold. It keeps vigilance active. It delays the necessary cognitive dampening. Now let's pivot to the inverse. What input tells the brain the agent is definitively dead?
The cue of death study. This investigated which cues actually diminished vigilance. Logically, you'd think seeing the body would be the most definitive cue.
That's what you think. But the sources suggest that the presence of an intact body was insufficient.
Insufficient.
That's one of the most sobering insights from the research. Exposure to an intact corpse was found to be insufficient to diminish false recognitions, because an intact but immobile body provides ambiguous cues. In modern Western cultures, the body is often prepared by morticians to look peaceful, even lifelike, asleep or resting. To the low-road system, an immobile, peaceful-looking figure does not provide the reliable, unambiguous input required to fully deactivate the agency detection system.
That's a stark contrast to how other species handle death. The sources mention chimpanzees.
Yes, chimpanzees, when they encounter a newly deceased member of their group, don't just observe. They inspect the body, they manipulate it, they might shake it, groom it, or even beat it.
They're testing it.
This aggressive inspection is believed to be their mechanism for rigorously testing the difference between a temporarily immobile living agent and a permanently dead entity. They need cues that go beyond mere stillness. They need unambiguous confirmation.
So what cue was effective at finally raising that detection threshold and shutting down the vigilance?
The study found that exposure to a non-intact corpse was the strongest negative predictor of false recognitions. Reliable, unambiguous cues of grievous injury, massive disruption, or significant bodily change provided the definitive input needed by the brain's evolved mechanisms to categorize the entity as permanently dead and not returning.
That's what raised the detection threshold and lowered cognitive vigilance.
Significantly. The brain needs closure, but that closure is biological and needs a very specific kind of input. It needs definitive, irreversible, unambiguous evidence of absence to accept the reality and begin the neurological work of transformation.
And this connection between our ancient wiring and modern practice is where the concept of cultural mismatch really hits home.
Yes. We've established that the pain of grief is a survival mechanism, but that mechanism evolved within a specific collective social framework. The pain is a biological signal that demands a communal response.
Let's look at how that worked in an ancestral or traditional environment. The source gives this amazing example of a woman named Eleni in a village.
I was struck by the story of Eleni, an elderly woman in a small coastal village in Crete. When her brother passed away, she did not retreat into silence.
What did she do?
Instead, she performed the traditional practice of sitting on her porch for 40 days, her rhythmic, often stylized lamentations echoing through the narrow streets. This public display was not seen as a private failing, but as a necessary civic function.
So her grief was a profound, visible flare sent up to her tribe.
It signaled not just personal pain, but a structural deficit in the community.
And how did the community respond to that biological signal?
They didn't avoid her because her pain was awkward. They responded with tangible support. Neighbors brought olives, fresh bread, wine, and they sat with her in long, necessary silences, sometimes for hours.
So this collective act functioned as a critical support mechanism.
Absolutely. Evolutionary psychology suggests that by publicly and ritualistically expressing her loss, Eleni triggered the community's social cohesion mechanisms. It forced the group to recognize the gap, redistribute the economic burdens of the loss, and knit themselves closer together to ensure collective survival.
And it also signaled her capacity to form high-cost bonds, reinforcing her future trustworthiness.
So the adaptive function of public, ritualized grief is twofold: maintaining social cohesion and ensuring that the burdens of loss are socially distributed. The loud, visible pain ensures the community pays attention.
The problem is we don't live in that environment anymore.
Not at all. And this brings us directly to the concept of evolutionary mismatch, where our evolved psychological needs clash violently with the environment of modern industrialized society.
This leads us to the contrasting experience of Mark, the software architect.
Mark, living in a high-rise in London, faced the loss of his partner of 8 years. The world expected him to compartmentalize and minimize the disruption.
He took 3 days off work,
Kept his camera off during Zoom calls, and spent his evenings in a silent, minimalist apartment. Mark described feeling unmoored and profoundly isolated, a ghost haunting his own efficient life.
This is the perfect example of the modern void. His deeply ingrained biological need for public, collective lamentation and support was met with cultural pressure for individual efficiency and emotional privacy.
For thousands of years, humans navigated this profound psychological restructuring through highly structured collective rituals that lasted weeks, months, or even years. These rituals provided external structure to map the internal chaos.
But Mark was attempting to perform the immense neurological work of transformation, the labor of an entire village, all by himself.
In silence, in a sterile environment that actively penalized the display of intense emotion. He wasn't just losing a partner. He was losing the communal validation and the structured map out of sorrow.
The profound implication of this mismatch is that we are trying to force an ancient social biological process into a modern, isolating, individualistic mold.
And this has massive consequences for how we approach grief practices today. Let's return to the findings on cues, for example. The clinical recommendation is often to encourage viewing mementos or realistic photographs to maintain continuing bonds.
But the Cue of Life study complicates that. It shows that frequent viewing of realistic photographs may actually delay the dampening of cognitive symptoms.
Right, because it's continually providing cues that the agent is still a viable relationship partner.
So it's a critical distinction.
It is. While these photos may provide a brief dopamine reward by activating the nucleus accumbens, a temporary feeling of closeness, they may actively hinder the crucial cognitive recalibration process.
The brain needs to definitively transition the representation of the loved one from an active agent to an integrated memory.
And constantly reintroducing the visual evidence of their living form undermines that transition.
The same goes for the preparation of the corpse, doesn't it? It's another victim of this modern desire for comfort and control.
Absolutely. Modern mortuary services minimize exposure to the definitive, unambiguous cues of death. They prepare the body to look lifelike, sleeping peacefully, the very definition of an ambiguous cue.
Which, as we learned, fails to fully deactivate the agency detection system.
So by trying to spare the bereaved the pain of disruption, we may inadvertently retard the necessary cognitive process. The brain is denied the non-intact, reliable input it needs to move past vigilance.
This circles back to the necessity of rituals, not just as social traditions, but as biological requirements for psychological health.
Traditional societies inherently understood grief as a necessary passage, requiring sustained, specific action. Rituals repeated, constant action, whether walking a designated path, collective chanting, or writing daily letters, provide the essential structure and temporal reference points the chaotic grieving mind needs.
They create a clear, integrated before and after.
And without that structure, the experience remains chaotic, and the brain struggles to classify the irreversible event.
Finally, we have to recognize that this neurological framework applies to losses that lack a body or any recognized public ritual whatsoever.
The profound, silent category of grief.
The loss of a relationship, a career, or an identity, like my friend grieving the woman she used to be.
The neurological mechanism is identical. It's still the massive labor of updating the predictive model. The story of Sarah, the violinist, shows this so vividly.
Tell us about Sarah and her experience of the grief of self.
Sarah was a young, highly skilled violinist in San Francisco. A sudden, debilitating injury permanently ended her career. She spoke not of physical pain, but of a constant mental phantom pain.
Phantom pain.
Every morning, she would instinctively tense her muscles, reaching for her bow, only to be struck by the crushing realization that her expected future, her physical capability, and her professional self were permanently absent.
Her entire self-identity was built into the map her brain was running.
Precisely. Her brain had spent decades encoding an internal predictive model where her hands performed specific complex tasks and her social status was tied to the stage. When that reality was irreversibly destroyed, her brain generated the exact same immense error signal as if a key attachment figure had died.
So she was forced into the immense labor of deleting that old identity map and constructing a new one from scratch.
Updating her self-representation, muscle memory, and expectations of future social interaction. It's a huge task.
This silent, profound grief of self is the realization of irreversible transformation after burnout or injury or the collapse of a defining relationship.
And trying to force continuity, trying to get back to the identical former self, is neurological futility. The living world demands change.
Whether it's the loss of a loved one or the loss of the career you were born to have, the brain is performing the same arduous neurological redrawing process.
Which means the duration of grief isn't a moral failing or a sign of weakness. It's the time required for sufficient lived experience to finally absorb the absence and update that foundational map accordingly.
So we've traced the intense pain of grief from an evolutionary paradox to a neurological engine of change. It's a signal management system designed to keep us vigilant, and a massive, slow learning curve required to redraw the world map.
The work, however painful, is profoundly functional, and this functionality transforms the relationship itself. The sources show us that the brain's ability to move forward doesn't require cutting ties.
No. In fact, the most common outcome involves what they call continuing bonds.
Continuing bonds, maintaining a meaningful internal connection with the deceased.
Which seems so much healthier than the idea of just closing a door.
Exactly. Our attachment neurobiology is robust enough that it allows us to form new, loving bonds while simultaneously honoring and transforming the old ones.
So the intense longing subsides as the lost figure transitions.
From being an active external relationship partner, the ghost in the room, to an integrated internal presence that informs our future and our identity. This is why people report feeling the deceased's presence or hearing their voice internally or channeling their remembered strengths.
It's the ultimate evidence of successful restructuring.
And it's the evidence that the brain is capable of helping us restore a meaningful life without requiring us to erase the past. It's not about choosing between the old love and the new life.
That's the key.
As one person articulated when discussing forming a new loving bond after years of grief, the thing is, it was really good then, and it's really good now. The brain eventually learns how to understand what life is like now, full of both the memory of suffering and the possibility of renewed joy.
So the final liberating insight we take from this deep dive into the science of loss is that the work of mourning is not about finding closure or forgetting the loss or forcibly closing a door.
It's about learning how to inhabit the room differently. It's a necessary, challenging, and profoundly creative act of internal reconstruction.